Take your seats. We'll get going in just a moment. to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. City Club is where we bring civic-minded people together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm KERVIN, president of City Club, and I would like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at Sentinel Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partner, Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, Family Health Care Plans, Legacy Health, Russell Fellow Properties, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Next week, we have two great after-hour events. On Monday, January 19th at Kells Downtown, we will have an event about universal health care with Senator Dembro, Representative Barbara Smith Warner, and Samuel Metz. On Thursday, the 22nd at Jimmy Mac's, we will talk about innovative solutions to money in politics with former Chief Justice Paul DeMunis, Alan Durning, Executive Director of Sightline, Deb Field, Executive Board Member of Main Street Alliance, and Commissioner Amanda Fritz. That event will be moderated by David Saracen. At next week's Friday Forum, we will discuss systematic approaches to health care with Dr. Leroy Hood, who helped pioneer the Human Genome Program in 1960. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, PDXCITYCLUB.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. And now to acknowledge the elephant in the room, many of you have heard, and if you haven't, we'll be losing our executive director, Sam Adams, to another organization. You'll be hearing more about our search for a new executive director, and thank you and send off for Sam Adams in the next few weeks, so please watch for that. Our moderator, Jesse Beason, will facilitate a Q&A session with the audience and our speakers at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. Hold your cards up high and City Club staff will collect them prior to the start of Q&A. And now for our program. Today is part 2 of our look ahead to the 2015 legislative session. We will hear from racial justice leaders from Center for Intercultural Organizing, Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, and Urban League of Portland. We will briefly look back at bills that led to progress for communities of color, as well as missed opportunities from the 2013 legislative session. We will focus on 3 legislative initiatives: Ban the Box, bills to end profiling, and guarantee paid sick leave. Join us today to set the tone for our program is Jen Lleras Vanderhagen, the director of the Race Program for the Western States Center. Western States Center builds power and connections among community-based organizations and leaders to transform individuals, institutions, and systems to achieve racial, gender, and economic justice. Jen will provide an overview of the report, Facing Race, the 2013 Oregon Legislative Report Card on Racial Equity. Jen?
Hello and thank you. It's an honor to be here today with all of you, and thank you to the Portland City Club for putting this on. My name is Jen Lleras Vanderhagen, and I'm the Race Program Director. And at Western State Center, like Karen said, we work on economic justice, gender justice, and racial justice. But we believe that it's extremely important to have a sharp point when we talk about racial justice, and that's because we want to ensure that democracy is working for everybody, and we believe that democracy works best when every community in the state is experiencing justice. And so, a little bit about me. I grew up in Corvallis, Oregon. I went to school at the University of Oregon. I've lived up and down the I-5 corridor, and so Oregon really is home for me. And today I'm going to tell you about a changing Oregon and what inspired 8 organizations to come together to develop a racial equity report card that could help our state be stronger. The Racial Equity Report Card is a tool for communities of color to do educational work with their organization's members to talk about the policies and the process that impacts all of their lives. It's also an important tool for accountability for decision makers and legislators in the state. Today, 1 in 5 people is an Oregonian of color. Let me just say that again, 1 in 5. Now, for those of you who have had the privilege of living in Oregon for multiple decades, you might remember that in 1990, 1 in 10 Oregonians was a person of color. And so this is dramatic and quick shifts that we're seeing in our state. And that might sound like a big shift, but I'll tell you, as a young girl who used to stand on her tiptoes to find her mother in a crowded room just looking for dark curly hair, it sure feels like a big shift. We have a lot more people of color in our state, and that's an exciting opportunity. Just so we're all clear, when I say people of color, we're talking about a lot of communities. We're talking about Asian and Pacific Islander communities, the African American community, Latino communities, and Native American communities, people. And so the diversity that exists within those communities is also enormous. Oregon's racial gaps run deep, and they undermine our ability to ensure stable and strong futures with fair opportunities and shared prosperity for all Oregonians. The changing population numbers and stark disparities demand that we pay attention to racial equity. Oregonians of color are twice as likely to face poverty at some point in their lives. Now, that comes from a lot of different things, but we know that Oregonians of color are more likely to be low-wage workers. They're more likely to have less access to health care and access to services that they need. We also know that there's a barrier in education, and that's because 50% of African American and Native American students who are in high school will not graduate by the time that within 4 years, so they will not graduate on time. And while Oregon is making immense strides forward and continuing to make policies to take care of this and to make Oregon schools work for everyone, we know that there are Oregon students of color who are being left behind and falling in the cracks. And that's not a system that's working for any of us, because we need everyone to have that solid foundation. These are just statistics to characterize the very real lived experiences of Oregonians across the state. Like many other states in our country, we're at an important crossroads. As a state, we have the opportunity to embrace our diverse communities, recognizing that it will make all of us stronger in the end. So our legislators in particular have significant power and influence to address racial disparity and racial equity. Both policy and budget decisions that folks make today can either increase opportunity and improve outcomes across lines of race, gender, and economics, or worsen those disparities. Now, many Oregonians actually think that we're just talking about legislators who need to serve their communities in Portland, right? Lots of folks will say, people of color, they live in the urban centers, that might be in Portland. We actually know that that's not true. There are plenty of people of color living in Portland, but some of the counties with the highest percentages of people of color in this state are rural counties. Between 30 and 40% of folks living in some counties are people of color, and that includes Malheur County all the way out in the southeast corner of the state, Marion County right in the center of our state, and Hood River County. So every legislator in the state, every decision maker has a role to play in making these decisions and making outcomes better for communities of color. So that's why we came together to create the Racial Equity Report Card. All of those things informed the need to create a tool that would allow us to do education with our members and to do education with legislators and to hold people accountable. So the 8 organizations that came together to build the Racial Equity Report Card are the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, Basic Rights Oregon, Kayse Oregon, the Center for Intercultural Organizing, the Coalition of Communities of Color, Partnership for Safety and Justice, the Urban League of Portland, and Western State Center. And we're not alone. There are about 40 organizations that exist as part of our advisory committee to help us develop the right strategies and plans for this report card. And that's because we believe that every single Oregonian should be represented in this process, and we believe that Oregonians of color come from many different backgrounds and have varied experiences, and we want all of them to be represented in this work. So the goals of the report card are that we want to help legislators understand the need for strong racial equity policy and to promote a rich conversation about what Oregon can and should look like. The report card should also be a tool that shines lights on the ways in which lawmakers and policymakers have made gains and identify opportunities for growth and missed opportunities. We've now created 2 racial equity report cards. In the first report card in 2011, we graded both chambers, the House and the Senate. In the second report card, we made the decision, a tough decision, to grade every single legislator. And that was because we wanted to ensure that we could first identify who our champions were and make sure to thank them and work with them on future legislative opportunities. And the second reason was that we wanted to identify who in our legislature wasn't with us quite yet, wasn't all the way there, because we believe that there are opportunities for education and continued conversation to find ways for everyone to play a role in advancing racial equity. So you might be wondering what makes racial equity policy? Because every single policy in the state impacts all people, right? And so we ask ourselves 4 questions. The first is, does it explicitly address racial disparities and work to eliminate racial inequities? The second, will it eliminate barriers to public benefits and institutions for communities of color? Does the legislation advance enfranchisement and full civic participation? And finally, will it protect against racial violence, profiling, and discrimination? We had an extremely successful legislative session in 2013. 18 of the 21 bills that the organizations that come together to develop the Racial Equity Report Card prioritized and worked on passed. So there was a gap, 18 of 21, that's a pretty significant win. Thank you. And yet we know there's a lot of room for growth. We know that every Oregonian can experience the Oregon that we all believe in. And so we left that session with 4 major recommendations for the legislature for the coming sessions. The first is to be explicit about addressing race, both in the conversations that we're having with our colleagues, the ways that we're talking about bills when they're in debate, and also in developing legislation. The second is to implement racial impact statements for bills that are being seriously considered, so that we don't find out later how people of color will be impacted, but so that we have a sense now before we put them into law. The third is to improve government data collection on race and ethnicity for all agencies. We need to know who we're serving, how we're serving them, and how we can improve those services. And then finally, proactively work with communities of color. We all have a role to play in making racial equity a reality, all of us. But legislators have the power and influence to make change that will impact every single person. Policy decisions that they make increase opportunities and outcomes or worsen disparities. And we have a shared fate. This state cannot truly prosper if we are leaving some communities behind. Our future depends on addressing racial equity. Legislators need to be explicit in working to develop and pass policies that will create fairness and equity for all. Yesterday was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and together we'll all celebrate his legacy on Monday. And yet nationally, conversations about race are still tough to reconcile. We hope that this is one tool that helps bring us together to reconcile those tough conversations and move forward together stronger. I'd now like to introduce to you Jesse Beason, the Director of Public Policy for the Northwest Health Foundation.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. Moving this way. Kathy Wei is Policy Coordinator for APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. Michael Alexander is President and CEO of the Urban League of Portland. And Kayse Jama is Executive Director of the Center for Intercultural Organizing. You can learn more about our panelists and their organizations on the City Club website. Also, I should note that our panelists paid me quite a large sum of money to make sure I noted that their organizations do not work alone. They work in alliances and coalitions with many more organizations to affect change on the topics that we'll cover today. Our panelists may mention them, and I'm sure that many of them are live tweeting right now. Today, our panelists will focus on 3 legislative initiatives they're helping to spearhead. So to kick us off, I've asked our panelists to spend 2 minutes summarizing their bills, and then we'll move right into our discussion. And I want to dive in with a topic we covered with the legislators who joined us at our forum last month, and that's paid sick days. Kathy, what are the key parts in the paid sick days bill?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jesse, and thank you to the City Club of Portland for having myself and APANO and many other organizations that we work with up here to talk about some of our key priority issues for the upcoming legislative session. So I'm sure many of you are already aware of the Portland and Eugene paid sick days ordinances that passed. And what this statewide bill would do is essentially allow employers to grant and implement a paid sick days law, basically, for all of their employees. So now how that would happen is that accrual of sick time will begin after 90 days of employment, and after every 30 hours work, the employer will get an hour's work of paid sick time. And so there's a couple of different specifics as to how that could go with the employer, but we are just really confident that because it passed in Portland and Eugene, that this is widely supported by many different groups and organizations. And I will dig deep into further details as we move forward.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Let's stay on this theme of employment. Michael, the bill the Urban League and other organizations are supporting is nicknamed Ban the Box. Can you fill us in on what Ban the Box would do?
Ban the Box would address the concern that many of us have regarding the barriers to employment that many individuals who have criminal histories face. 32,000 individuals within the state of Oregon are under the supervision of the Department of Correction, whether they're institutionalized or under community supervision. Upon discharge, upwards of 75% of those individuals are unable to find employment regardless of the nature of their offense or the efforts that they have undertaken in terms of rehabilitation and successful reentry. This relegates these folks to second-class citizenship, and in many ways, it's double jeopardy. It also creates unnecessary barriers on employers in terms of being able to find talent that they need. The Ban the Box legislation would, in fact, require that employers remove the requests for information around criminal history from the application process and have that information become available later on, hopefully in the course of an interview, but later on in the process.
Great, thank you, Michael. Kayse, your bill tries to address criminal justice from the other side, and that is racial profiling by law enforcement. Can you summarize what changes you want to see made in Salem?
Well, thank you, Jesse, and thank you very much for the City Club for having us. I think before I start, let me tell you, I came to this state about 16 years ago, and as a new Oregonian, you might wonder why do I have to do anything about or care about profiling. As you know, in this country, this summer, we struggle, a lot of us, in terms of what profiling and police accountability means to us, as the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and others came to life in our televisions and our networks. This is a national phenomenon. This is a national issue, but it also impacts us Oregonians. We have to address the problem. There is no question about the people of color, immigrant refugees, others, Native American, Latinos, LGBTQ community face some sort of way of profiling. It's time as a state, as a nation, that we have to come together and address this issue. CIO, Center for Intercultural Organizing, and many of our partners are addressing and pushing 3 fundamental bills that we believe that will have impact, although might not end profiling. The first bill will define profiling and will prohibit law enforcement agencies solely relying on someone's race, language, housing status, sexual orientation, gender, identity as basis to stop someone. The next bill, it will be a bill that will collect the data. We know that if we don't have the data, we don't understand what we are dealing with. It will give the state's attorney general the authority to collect complaints about profiling by law enforcement residing in Oregon. The last bill will also address the issues of data collection. The law enforcement will report to their stops and individual belonging to one of the main protected class that I mentioned. So those are the 3 major areas that we believe. But at the end of the day, we believe profiling, as a community, we have to work together to stop and end profiling.
Thank you, Kayse. Michael, you said Ban the Box would help eliminate barriers for employers, but how is it not making it harder for employers to go through the hiring process?
You know, I think, hopefully this is live. Okay, great. I think one of the things that I want to underscore to employers is that the summarial discharge of individuals who have criminal histories from even an application creates an artificially smaller pool of qualified candidates for them to interview. We know that many of these folks are individuals who are able to demonstrate that they are on a path to rehabilitation and that they are also able to be contributors. We also know that there's a disproportionate impact on communities of color. You know, African Americans are 2% of the state. They're roughly 12% of the individuals who are represented within this. As we look at unemployment statistics, this is another barrier that continues to place greater disparate impact on unemployment within our community. Employers in this legislation would not be prohibited from asking about criminal backgrounds. They would not be prohibited from placing individuals in positions where there are restrictions against certain types of criminal backgrounds and safety-sensitive positions. And they would not be forced to hire anyone who they didn't want to hire. What we're asking is that everyone be given the opportunity to have their qualifications looked at along with their history. And if the box is checked early in the process, that rarely happens. The National Labor Employment Project did a survey of employers. 66% of them admitted when they saw the box checked, they just moved on to the next applicant. And that had nothing to do with the nature of the offense. It had nothing to do with its impact on the type of work that they were applying for. And in many instances, it meant that individuals who had the opportunity to become tax contributors were now going to continue to be a drain on community and the state and employers as a whole.
Thank you. Kathy, I want to ask you a similar question. How does paid sick days not make it harder for employers to hire? Or in other words, how does this bill actually a good thing for business in Oregon?
So right now, we know that there are 130,000 people of color who don't have access to any type of paid sick time on the job. And slightly less than half, so about 47% of total Oregonians working in the private sector do not have any type of paid sick time. And so, we know that when we look at who don't get paid sick time, they are more likely to be single parents, heading households with children. They tend to be folks of color, as I mentioned before, and they also tend to be folks who are low-wage workers. So when we think about the economy and the economic recession and what that did for our workforce, it has created larger barriers for folks who are trying to get out of the recession, who are trying to, climb up the steps out of poverty. Without having paid sick time, it makes it harder for them to keep a job because a lot of these folks are fearful that if they have to stay at home to take care of a sick child with a cold, for example, that their employer may fire them. And so by not having sick time, it's not good for our economy because there is a whole class of folks, as I said before, low-wage workers in particular, who are sometimes the backbone, right, of a lot of our services and our industries, who don't have this basic benefit and right. And so if an employer doesn't give them at least the minimum amount of what is requested, then it affects all of us, and it affects some of the hardest working Oregonians here in the state, who are in our restaurant industries, who are in our cleaning services and landscaping jobs, as an example.
Thank you. Kayse, you mentioned how profiling is really in the national conversation right now. But I'm wondering if you know where Oregonians are at when it comes to this issue.
Well, let me first say this. As a state, Oregon never fired one single law enforcement officer for killing a person of color. We have no statute that defines what profiling means. Each agency is left to its own terms to determine how they're going to collect the data and how they're going to address issues of profiling. Question for me, I had a long conversation a while back. Our former police chief, Chief Sizer, who we used to sit and have a coffee together. And I think one of the questions we used to talk about is whether this profiling exists or does not exist. And I think a lot of times people, law enforcement agents say it's a perception. It's not real. And I think as a community of color, immigrant refugee, we know that that's not the reality we face. So in Oregon, it's actually an issue for Oregonians. We get complaints across the state. My agency, as I sit in my office, many community members walk into our offices sharing their experience. Just last Sunday, 11 o'clock at night, I got a call, one of my board members, Sharif, who lives in Beaverton, 11 o'clock, and he's just said, I just been profiled. And I think those kind of conversations, it's happening statewide, profiling is happening statewide, but this is an issue of Oregon. Let me give you an example, another statistics. According to the article that's published by the Scanner, from January 2010 to 2014, there has been 101 deadly force used by the law enforcement agencies. And that includes 92 shootings. That resulted 43 deaths. And those statistics, 22 only happened in Portland. Rest of them was across the state. So this issue, although people seem to be sometimes conceived it's only happening northeast Portland, this is a statewide issue, and we have to approach and address this as a statewide phenomenon.
Thank you. Michael, the economy in Oregon is getting better, as we've seen from a lot of recent data. So won't people with previous convictions benefit and naturally find employment as a result?
You know, I think we would hope that that would be the case, but so far the data has shown us that there continues to be significant disparities between the employment rate gains of communities of color and ex-offenders and the recovery. We know in many instances that employment practices will still follow the patterns that had been exhibited prior to the recession. And at that point, as I said, upwards of 75% of these individuals with criminal histories were unemployed. And you know, one of the things that I will say is, as a taxpayer, all of us are contributing into programs and efforts to provide training and rehabilitation services for individuals in the penal system. I will fully admit that recidivism exists. I will fully admit that there will be individuals who come out of that system who go right back in. But the box on an application does not distinguish between that individual and the person who is successfully invested in their future, who has made a successful transition back into the community, who is working to realign with community interest and families and business interest, who's done everything that we have asked them to do to navigate back to the path of righteousness. The box doesn't differentiate between those two. Dialogue does. And that's what we're asking.
Thank you. Kayse, at our legislative preview forum last month, right here on this stage, Representative Val Hoyle shared the experience of a community in New Jersey and made the argument that local policing changes were perhaps more important to ending racial profiling, not necessarily passing a law to outlaw it. In fact, she said maybe it would make folks feel better, but questioned if it would actually make a difference on the ground. And she's not the only one saying that. So why is outlawing the practice needed?
I think it's an important question, and I think the reality is that we cannot regulate culture. We cannot regulate how individual person's beliefs and ingrained history of where they come from. We cannot regulate that. What we can regulate is how our systems and law enforcement agencies behave or conduct their business or their policing. There's no question about that. Police bias is an issue. What we can do is ensure that people, when they feel that they have been profiled, one, there's a mechanism that complain, and that complaint, there's a statewide system that processes that complaint, and so people believe that they can, there is accountability. The second piece of the issue is that we have to ensure that our law enforcement agencies have the definition what is profiling is and what they can and cannot do in terms of, and so they have to have a clear understanding what that means. So for me, the issue is that what I said earlier is that creating and trying to define culture, it's a one thing, but really holding the system is accountable, it's due. So we need that system. We have to have accountability in our system, and we ensure that our community members feels that they enjoy the full protection of the law. That's really what we are after, and that's what we are advocating as an agency, and that's what we're advocating as a coalition.
Thank you. So also at last month's forum, Kathy, this question is for you. Senator Steiner Hayward noted that for her, this was a public health issue. She's a physician. She really saw this as public health. I'm wondering what other kinds of sector support are you seeing around paid sick days?
Well, that's a great question. So, yes, this is definitely a public health issue. workers, if they are sick, should stay at home and not spread any other sicknesses or illnesses to other people. Other sectors that are in support of this is obviously those in the labor movement, of course, as well as a lot of businesses, actually, for some of the reasons that I had stated earlier about, about just strengthening our workforce and making sure that they are keeping the best people in their jobs and they're not losing them due to, due to a sickness that progressively becomes worse because they don't have something implemented in their policies to give folks the right amount of time off. So I would say the business community, obviously we are a part of a huge coalition that actually went public called the Fair Shot Coalition, and it's a lot of our faith, labor, community-based organizations, community leaders who are really in full support of this issue. So we have a full coalition of folks who want to see this happen for all parts of Oregon.
And what do you see as the prospects of this happening in this session?
I believe that we are really hopeful that this is going to be, obviously a huge issue, number one, but I think we have really good support from a lot of our key electeds and a couple of the legislatures that we've talked to around this issue. And as I was saying before, we have a big coalition that that APANO and some of these other organizations are also a part of to help move this agenda. And I also want to mention that on the public health lens, we are also a part of the Oregon Health Equity Alliance, which is made up of community-based organizations and other groups that are looking at decreasing health disparities.
So, Michael, some of the same criticisms lobbed at the racial profiling bills could be lobbed at ban the box, right? Just getting rid of the box doesn't solve the problem. So I'm wondering, what else could we be doing as a state that really focuses on improving the job prospects for people with prior convictions?
Well, I think that it clearly is a pervasive barrier to employment, but it is not the only one. We will look at a number of the other bills that are in front of us and in front of the legislature to look at what are some of the upstream impacts. Obviously, the focus on education and addressing educational disparities begins to avoid what many of us refer to as the school-to-prison pipeline, which is disproportionately populated by children from communities of color. We also need to understand that there are states that have faced this issue and are much farther along the path to solution than Oregon is. As much as we pride ourselves on our progressivism, there are 13 states that have passed ban-the-box legislation or ordinances. 70 cities and counties have also done it, including the city of Portland and Multnomah County in their own hiring practices. So I think there's a lot that we can do if we can look to places where we believe better practices have already begun to emerge, and what are the other issues that circulate around